Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. We are coming to you from the Ideas Pod studio in New Delhi on the sidelines of the Raisina Dialogue 2025. We are collaborating with Raisina Dialogue and the Observer Research Foundation to bring you the Ideas Pod, and we hope you've been catching our coverage. Today on Vantage, we begin with the war in Ukraine. A critical call took place yesterday between US President Donald Trump and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin. Trump has been pushing for a ceasefire in Ukraine and he got Putin's nod, but only for a partial ceasefire. You look at what happened during this call, what Putin's demands are, and where all of this leaves Ukraine. We also look at Europe, at how the continent is spooked, and how they're planning to deal with Russia. And we are focusing on a new boycott movement that is taking shape in Europe, targeting American goods. We bring you updates from Israel and Gaza after the ceasefire there came to an abrupt halt yesterday. All this and more lined up for you on the show, but first, the headlines.
US President Donald Trump hosts top oil executives as he charts plans to boost domestic energy production amid looming trade wars. This marks his first sit-down with oil and gas leaders since returning to the Oval Office. The Philippines says it is trying to expand the Squad grouping of nations to include India and South Korea to counter China's aggression in the Indo-Pacific. Turkish police arrest Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, a key rival of President Erdogan, as part of an investigation into alleged corruption and terror links. This comes just days before his expected presidential race nomination for the 2028 election. Hours after peace talks in Angola failed, presidents of DR Congo and Rwanda expressed their support for a ceasefire after surprise talks in Qatar. And Google to pay $28 million to settle a class action lawsuit claiming the Alphabet unit favored white and Asian employees by paying them more and putting them on higher career tracks than the others.
Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have spoken, and the verdict is in. Russia is not ending the war in Ukraine yet. Trump did not get the deal that he was hoping for, but he has an opening. Trump is perhaps the closest any leader has come to ending this war. He has managed to extract some concessions. There will be a limited ceasefire in Ukraine. Here are the details. The Trump-Putin phone call lasted over 2 hours. They spoke for more than 2 hours, and the bottom line is this: Russia will not attack Ukraine's energy infrastructure. That is what they've agreed to. This halt is for 30 days. Russian forces will not attack Ukraine's energy infrastructure for a month. So facilities like power stations will remain safe. But Ukraine's civilians are still vulnerable. So are Ukrainian cities and ports. The fighting will continue there. But Russia has also made some gestures of goodwill. In this phone call, Putin committed to a few things, like releasing some Ukrainian prisoners of war. And this release is going to happen in 2 rounds. First, some 23 Ukrainian soldiers will be released. They were seriously wounded during the fighting and they were being treated in Russian hospitals. Now they will be freed. In the second round, there will be a prisoner exchange. 175 prisoners will be released from each side. That's 175 from Ukraine and another 175 from Russia. Now, even though this is a limited ceasefire, this is no doubt a breakthrough. For the first time in a 3-year war, hostilities will cease. The White House has issued a statement. It has termed this truce a step towards peace. Even though the US did not get the agreement it was hoping for, a week ago, US and Ukrainian officials met in Saudi Arabia. We told you about this, and they agreed to a comprehensive ceasefire, one that would have completely stopped the fighting and started negotiations for a truce. But Russian President Putin was not open to that. Russia has made extensive demands from both the US and Europe to end this war, and we'll tell you about those demands in just a bit. But first, let's tell you about Donald Trump. What did the US president say about the phone call. Trump has issued a statement on Truth Social, his own social media platform. He said the phone call was, quote-unquote, very good and productive. Trump is confident that this would lead to a complete ceasefire. But in an interview later, Trump conceded that Russia has the advantage.
Well, you have a situation where you have a lot of guns pointing at each other foolishly, because it would have never happened if I were president. That was not a war that was supposed to happen. And it did happen. So that's where we are. And right now, you have a lot of guns pointing at each other. And a ceasefire, without going a little bit further, would have been tough. Russia has the advantage, as you know. They have encircled about 2,500 soldiers. They are nicely encircled, and that's not good.
On the other side, the Kremlin released an extensive summary of the call. The leaders covered far more ground. Trump and Putin discussed the conflict in West Asia, the tensions in the Red Sea, economic and energy cooperation, and some sports too. Putin suggested that ice hockey teams from both countries should play matches. And apparently Trump welcomed the idea. So you could say the ice has been broken. 6 months ago, a phone call like this would have been hard to imagine. Then President Joe Biden had boycotted Putin. Biden termed him a pariah. But the past few weeks have shown how flawed that approach was. Putin and Russia are far from being isolated, and now they're back in the global spotlight, with the US under Trump discussing ways to end conflicts in Ukraine and West Asia. So where does this leave Ukraine? Yesterday's phone call only reaffirms Kyiv's weak position. President Zelensky has issued a statement. He said he was waiting for Trump's call to discuss what he discussed with Putin.
We support all steps aimed at the end of the war. We will support them. But in order to support them, we need to understand what exactly we support. When President Trump has time, he is a busy man. When he has time, he can call me anytime. He has my phone number. We are ready to talk through further steps with pleasure.
And he managed to get that phone call today. He managed to get Trump on the phone earlier today. Both leaders had a call. Ukraine's future is being decided here, remember, and Zelensky says he'd like to know what he's getting into. It is a fair ask, but it also shows what his position is. It's a question that we put to Ukraine's foreign minister yesterday. His name is Andriy Sybiha. We asked him if Ukraine has any leverage in these talks, and this is what he said. What leverage does Ukraine have at this point?
We need support of international community.
Diplomacy will work after more than 2 years of war and thousands of sanctions?
I believe, yes.
You think Russia will give up the territory? It's a yes or no question. If there is no ceasefire, do you propose to keep fighting?
We are ready to resist.
How do you keep fighting?
You ask me once again the same question.
Because you've not answered my question.
We have enough capacities to keep fighting.
Like they say, when you're not in the room, you are on the menu. Trump may not have got the deal he wanted, but he very much holds the power to shape Ukraine's future along with Putin. 3 years into this war, Zelensky has fewer options than he started with. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, it's business as usual. We've seen another round of attacks overnight. Both Russia and Ukraine attacked each other, and this happened right after the Trump-Putin phone call finished. Both sides launched dozens of drones at each other. Russia accuses Ukraine of hitting an oil depot. That might count as energy infrastructure, and that is something that Putin agreed that he will not target. But within hours of that concession, Ukraine has been accused of hitting Russian energy infrastructure. So you can see how tenuous this limited ceasefire is. Nevertheless, a partial truce is in place. So it is a small win for Trump because he has been personally involved in these negotiations. The US says talks on the next step will begin immediately on Sunday in Saudi Arabia. And Russia has reportedly agreed to this. Moscow will lay down all its demands there. But we already have a fair idea what Putin wants. The Kremlin released a statement after the Putin-Trump call, and I'll highlight some of the points that they made. Russian President Putin wants to know who will control and monitor the border, the line of contact between Russia and Ukraine. Who will control it? Who will monitor it? Next, he wants Ukraine to stop its forced mobilization. He wants Kyiv to stop bolstering its military. Putin does not want them to rearm during a ceasefire. And this is the most crucial part. He says, and I quote, "The key condition for preventing the escalation of the conflict and working towards its resolution through political and diplomatic means should be a complete cessation of foreign military aid and the provision of intelligence information to Kyiv." Basically, Putin wants the West to stop helping Ukraine. Only then will he agree to a complete ceasefire. So no more weapons, no more intelligence. Ukraine will have to be left to fend for itself. That is Russia's ask. It is a tough ask. Donald Trump may agree to it. He has already done this before, so he might agree to do it again. But the US is not the only one backing Ukraine here. There's still Europe. French President Emmanuel Macron was in Germany yesterday meeting outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And this is what he said after the Trump-Putin call.
We, of course, followed the telephone conversation between U.S. President Trump and Russian leader Putin. We have also been in contact with President Zelensky and the USA, and were therefore able to speak about it immediately before this press conference. We are in complete agreement that the goal of all efforts must be a just and lasting peace for Ukraine.
Going back to Ukraine, we continue to support the Ukrainian army in its war of resistance faced with Russian aggression, and we're right to do that. The first steps are being made, but the objective must remain the same. A measurable and verifiable ceasefire, completely respected, opening detailed and complete peace discussions which will allow a solid and lasting peace and the guarantees that go with it. That's our objective. And of course, that's not conceivable without the Ukrainians sitting around the table. And that's a position we have consistently maintained.
Europe wants security guarantees for Ukraine. They want a just peace. And they say it cannot be done without Ukraine at the negotiating table. It sounds like they won't stop sending arms and intelligence to Kyiv, not unless Ukraine tells them to stop. And this would violate Putin's quote-unquote key condition. So will Putin soften his stance, or will he be willing to compromise on some of his demands? It appears unlikely at the moment, but we will know for sure after the talks on Sunday. Ending a war is rarely straightforward. Even the prospect of a ceasefire, let alone agreeing to one, comes with complications. And this is the very position that Ukraine finds itself in. It agreed to a 30-day frontline-wide ceasefire without conditions. It seems to have memorized and repeated the words just and lasting peace. But what did it get instead? A theatrical week-long wait, then a limited ceasefire, and a Kremlin readout which says prisoner swaps, hockey matches, more talks, and a month-long mutual pause on energy infrastructure attacks. That's the gist of it. Like we said, it is complicated. Take the last bit, for instance. Moscow says it won't attack Ukraine's energy infrastructure if Kyiv agrees to do the same. But we told you what happened last night. Both sides launched air attacks on each other. Russia accuses Ukraine of hitting an oil depot. So much for a mutual pause on energy infrastructure attacks. While Ukraine says Russia targeted civilian infrastructure overnight, including hospitals. Basically, there is a glimmer of hope with this limited ceasefire, but the situation in general remains bleak. So what does this mean for Ukraine? For starters, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky felt left out, at least yesterday. Yesterday's call was another sign of Ukraine's weak position. The country is at war, its future is being decided, and let alone getting a seat at the table, Zelensky had little knowledge what was discussed.
We support all steps aimed at the end of the war. We will support them. But in order to support them, we need to understand what exactly we support. When President Trump has time, he is a busy man. When he has time, he can call me anytime. He has my phone number. We are ready to talk through further steps with pleasure.
Zelensky's frustration must have been apparent because Trump has dialed him tonight to discuss the details of yesterday's call. But this is the hard truth. Hours after the call with Russia, Ukraine did not know what it was getting into. And to everyone but Zelensky, this is not surprising. In recent days, Moscow has ramped up attacks. It has pushed to drive out Ukrainian troops from the Kursk region, which could have been an important bargaining chip for Kyiv in potential negotiations. Now Ukraine is clearly deprived of it. And this gives Russia momentum on the battlefield and a stronger hand at the negotiation table. With Trump, of course. Last month, Trump's rhetoric may have been harsh, but he gave Zelensky the gist of the matter. He said, "You don't have the cards right now." And we saw this play out last night as well. Russian President Vladimir Putin reiterated his demands. He wants an end to foreign military and intelligence assistance to Ukraine. He wants Kyiv to stop bolstering its military. And by the looks of it, Putin is not budging, which undermines Kyiv's demands. It wants the ability to defend itself, and it wants this ability to remain unrestricted.
It is not type of the game where Putin is the only one to impose his rules. I think military aid will continue. We have aid from both the United States and our European colleagues. I am certain there will be no betrayal from the partner's side and that the flow of military aid will continue.
Well, he is right. This is not a game. This is a conflict. And no matter how entertaining the theatrics, no matter how many narratives politicians spin, outcomes of conflicts are determined on the battlefield, where Kyiv remains weak. And yesterday's phone call proves this. It underscores how Ukraine's alternative to a war in its fourth year cannot be the utopia of the just and lasting peace that it wants. Peace in Ukraine will come at a price, and maybe Zelensky should make peace with that. So those were the main players, the US, Russia and Ukraine. But what about the rest? What about the Western nations backing Ukraine? Well, they are still terrified. They are afraid that Russia will target them next, once it is done with Ukraine. So Europe is gearing up to defend itself. A number of events have just taken place across multiple European countries within the last 2 days. Let's go through them one by one, and we are starting with Germany. It is Europe's economic powerhouse. Yesterday, it broke its shackles. It relaxed its borrowing rules. This allows Germany to take on more debt, to borrow money to spend more on defense. It wasn't easy, of course. It required a 2/3 majority in the German parliament. But the incoming chancellor, Friedrich Merz, said that there was no other option. This was the pitch he made before German lawmakers.
We have believed in a deceptive security in our society for at least a decade, probably much more. Now we have to rebuild our defense capabilities, partly from scratch, using a technology-driven defense and procurement strategy, with automated systems, with autonomous European satellite surveillance, with armed drones, and with many modern defense systems. And such a debt can only be justified under very specific circumstances and conditions. The circumstances are primarily determined by Putin's war of aggression against Europe. It is indeed a war against Europe, not just a war against the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
Merz said Germany needed to take on debt to improve its defenses. If it did not, Vladimir Putin would come for them. It's a bit like the story that parents tell their children, "Eat all your veggies or the scary monster will come and get you." Merz basically did the same thing, and it worked.
Ballots cast 720, yes votes 513, no votes 207, no abstentions. According to Article 79, Paragraph 2 of the Basic Law, the adoption of the law requires a 2/3 majority of the members of the German Bundestag. That would be 489 yes votes. The proposed bill has been approved with the required majority.
Some German citizens may not want to increase their debt. They may be horrified with what just happened. But you know who's happy? France.
I wanted to come back to several things. Firstly, to congratulate you on the historic vote of the Bundestag, which is good news for Germany and good news for Europe. Good news because it will mean more for defense and investment, and we need it.
French President Emmanuel Macron is thrilled because this fits right into his plans. Germany will loosen the purse strings and spend more on defense. Macron has long been talking about bolstering European defense. He wants an army for Europe. He has decided that France too will spend more on upgrading its defenses. President Macron made this announcement yesterday.
And I want to tell you that the Air Force will benefit from more orders of Rafales. This is a necessity in the current context. It is also a natural choice to integrate the effort of the airmen vis-à-vis Ukraine with the decommissioning of our Mirage jets. Yes, we will increase and accelerate our orders for Rafales.
France plans to modernize its air force. It plans to buy more Rafale fighter jets to upgrade its existing squadrons. So that was France and Germany. These are Europe's biggest economies, but they aren't the only ones planning for Russian aggression. Eastern European nations are arguably more scared. Nations like Poland, Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia, they are the ones that border Russia. They have previously been ruled by Moscow directly or indirectly, so these nations are on high alert and they have come up with a plan. Admittedly, a rather old-fashioned one. Poland and the Baltic nations are bringing back landmines. About 160 countries around the world have banned the use of landmines. We're talking about anti-personnel landmines, the ones that target humans. They were first banned in 1997. The Baltic nations joined this ban only in 2005 and Poland joined in 2012. But now these 4 countries are pulling out because they say Russia cannot be trusted. So you see how Europe is using the threat of Russia to arm itself. And this is bound to increase tensions and possibly anger Russia further. Let's hope Europe's fear-mongering does not become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So Europe is scared. It is gearing up to defend itself and bolstering its military. Do you know what else it is doing? Europe is preparing for the worst-case scenario with bunkers and survival kits for its people. And France is the latest country to join this club. It is working on a survival manual. This is a bit like a guide. It will tell people how they can protect themselves in the face of an imminent threat, like war. So what will the survival manual include? And which other European countries are coming up with bunker plans and survival kits? Here's a report.
Europe is scared. The threat of a Russian attack looms large, so European countries are gearing up to defend themselves. Look at France. President Emmanuel Macron is boosting the country's air force. He wants to increase orders for Rafale fighter jets. He wants to prepare in case of a potential confrontation and be ready whether or not the United States stays by France's side.
Notre pays et notre continent.
Our country and our continent will have to continue to defend, equip and prepare if we want to avoid war. That is the choice we have made and will continue to make. Deterrence is a historical and essential component of the defense of the nation, and it is an opportunity for our country. That is why we will continue to strengthen each of its components.
But that's not all that France is doing. The government is also preparing for the worst-case scenario, and it wants the citizens to be prepared as well. Which is why France plans to send a survival manual to every household in the country. What will this manual include? It will be a 20-page booklet. It will advise people on how they can protect themselves in case of an imminent threat. The manual will also have emergency numbers and simple reminders like closing one's doors and windows during a nuclear threat. Apart from this booklet, France also plans to urge people to prepare a survival kit for themselves with water, tins of food, batteries, torches and basic medical supplies. The purpose of this, according to the government, is to ensure the resilience of populations in the face of all types of crisis, whether natural, technological, cyber or security related. It is clear why France is worried.
Nul ne sait dire ce qui adviendra dans les mois, les années qui viennent.
No one knows what will happen in the months, years to come. What I want is for us to be ready. What I want is for us to be protected.
Culture de l'engagement, à la force de nos armées.
And France is hardly the only one. So is Germany. The European economic powerhouse has relaxed its borrowing rules. It wants to boost military spending. Now, that's a major step forward on the defense front. But Germany too is looking at survival mode. In case worst comes to worst, Germany wants its people to be bunker ready. In recent months, Germany has drawn up a list of bunkers that could provide emergency shelter to civilians. This includes underground train stations, car parks and buildings. The country is building an app, kind of like a digital directory of these bunkers, so people can locate them in case of an attack. So that's how Europe's 2 biggest economies are preparing for Putin. But other nations in the region aren't far behind. the Polish government has a survival guide in case of war. It advises the public on how to survive a potential attack or a foreign occupation. Denmark, Sweden, Finland and Norway have released similar manuals for the public as well. Europe can only hope that it doesn't come to this. But when it's about survival, it's always better to be prepared.
The previous story showed you how Europe is scared, but many in the continent are also angry. I'm talking about ordinary people, your average Joe, or I suppose your average Johan. Either way, ordinary Europeans are angry, and not just at Russia, but increasingly also at America. And this is thanks to US President Donald Trump. Trump's stance on Ukraine has upset some Europeans. They feel it's a betrayal of Western values to support Putin over Zelensky. And that's one reason for the anger, but perhaps the bigger reason is Trump's trade war. Donald Trump has threatened to impose tariffs on everyone. He has already done it to Canada and Mexico. He has tariffed steel and aluminium from everywhere, but things are about to get worse. New tariffs are set to arrive on the 2nd of April, and it's likely that no one will be spared, no matter how closely they're linked to the US. They will face American tariffs, and this has hurt the Europeans, who see the tariffs as a betrayal of the Western alliance. Ordinary people, of course, cannot influence geopolitics, not directly at least, but they can exercise the power of their wallets. An average person can still make their frustration felt by choosing to boycott American goods, and that's exactly what the Europeans seem to be doing. They're boycotting American brands or products made in the US, and leading the charge are the Nordic countries. Denmark, of course, right up front. The Danes are especially angry because of Trump's tariffs, his approach to Ukraine and Greenland. Greenland, as you would know, is an autonomous Danish territory, but Trump wants to take it over. This has angered ordinary Danish citizens, so they are finding ways to push back. Denmark's biggest supermarket chain is helping with the boycott. It has come up with a simple identification system, a black star on its price tags. The star means that a product is made in Europe. It's as simple as that. The supermarket still stocks American goods. They haven't been removed. But the star system makes boycotting US goods easier. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. You have new apps coming out allowing people to scan products and determine if they are European. Then there are online communities, Facebook groups with tens of thousands of members all discussing ways to boycott the US. And I know it is ironic, boycotting American goods on Facebook, which is an American social media giant. The groups know this too. But they say nothing else gives them as much reach. This is how the boycott movement is growing in Europe. It follows a similar movement in Canada.
There's an enormous Buy Canada, enormous Buy Local movement on the go. It's not a big marketing company coming up with an idea. It's grassroots, it's organic, it's from Canadians themselves, and that's what we have to grasp is how big this movement is. It's kind of swept across the country overnight by itself.
The movement seems to be sweeping across Europe as well, and it seems to have swept away one brand in particular, Tesla. These days, Tesla CEO Elon Musk is synonymous with Trump because he funded Trump's election campaign, and now he's a top advisor to the US president. So obviously, Europeans are targeting Musk too. Tesla sales in Europe were down by 45% in January, 45% compared to a year ago. Europeans are switching to local alternatives, even if they're more expensive. And sometimes the anti-Tesla sentiment has turned violent. The cars have even been set on fire. All of this shows European anger. It would have been unthinkable just a few months ago, this level of anger against the United States of America. But this is the reality now, and things may get worse on April 2nd, when the new batch of Trump tariffs come into effect. Last year, Ramzan in Gaza started on an optimistic note. There were ceasefire talks. Those talks did not yield peace, but this year, the Strip has had more to cheer about. A ceasefire deal was finally reached and Gaza was picking up the pieces, especially during the holy month for Muslims. They were hoping for an Eid without airstrikes. But Israel's strikes have shattered all such hopes. On Monday, Gazans woke up to Israeli airstrikes. More than 400 people have reportedly been killed, including 174 children. It is one of the single highest one-day child death tolls in Gaza's history. And Israel says it is not done. Reports suggest that it is preparing for more strikes. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says all negotiations will now take place under fire.
I have promised you many times, if Hamas persists in its refusal and does not release our hostages, we will return to fighting. And indeed, we have returned to fighting. We have returned to fighting with strength. From now on, Israel will act against Hamas with ever-increasing force. From now on, negotiations will take place only under fire.
Yesterday, I spoke to Eden Bartal. He is the Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I asked him if the airstrikes would be followed by a ground operation. He did not rule out the possibility. Listen to what he said.
Naturally, we cannot disclose any further details about Israeli plans to the public. However, we will take every measure necessary to free the hostages. I would say that the objectives of this war, which Hamas started, were outlined from the beginning by the Israeli cabinet and have remained unchanged.
So what's the reason for this offensive? Israel says it is trying to force Hamas to release the Israeli hostages in the Strip. Remember, the 2025 Gaza ceasefire had 3 phases. Phase 1 was a temporary ceasefire, including an exchange of hostages and Palestinian prisoners. During this phase, talks were supposed to start for the second phase. The second phase of a permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. But Israel is said to have avoided those talks. It says Hamas has used the ceasefire to rearm and regroup, and that it is planning a new attack on Israel.
Hamas remains an active terrorist organization that controls Gaza, and despite ample time for negotiation, it has refused to release hostages or lay down its weapons. Israel has no choice but to act in order to free its hostages and protect its citizens.
Meanwhile, Itamar Ben-Gvir has been reappointed as the security minister. Ben-Gvir left the government over disagreements about the ceasefire. He had left Netanyahu's government with a thin parliamentary majority. But now, with the ceasefire in peril, Ben-Gvir is back. He has joined the government again. Meanwhile, the Israeli opposition is up in arms. They have accused the government of having no red lines. Former Prime Minister Yair Lapid has called for mass protests. He wants the public to come out in the streets. Across the world, protests are already taking place in multiple countries. People are asking Netanyahu to resign. This crisis is no longer confined to Gaza. The region is on edge, with new flashpoints emerging. US forces have bombed several places in Yemen. This includes Sada and Hodeidah. The Houthis have hit back. They attacked another US warship in the Red Sea, which is the second such strike in 24 hours. So as tensions escalate in Gaza, fears of a wider conflict are mounting. The fragile hopes of a lasting truce have been shattered by the fresh strikes. And the humanitarian toll continues to rise. With each passing day, the path to peace is becoming harder to see. As the world watches, protests rage and diplomats scramble for solutions. For those on the ground, survival is the only immediate concern. The question now is not just how this war will end, but whether it will ever truly end. Now let's talk about trade, or rather the weaponization of trade as a form of foreign policy. We are seeing it in real time with the way Donald Trump uses tariffs. He slaps tariffs on Canada. They respond in kind. So then Trump threatens to double the tariffs. He tariffs the EU. They respond. So Trump threatens 200% tariffs on wine and champagne. Clearly, tariffs are no longer being imposed just for economic advantage or protectionism. They are now being used punitively to force another country's hand. But Trump did not start this trend. It has been going on for years with sanctions. The concept of economic sanctions is essentially the same: the weaponization of trade. Earlier today, I spoke about this to Dr. S. Jaishankar, India's External Affairs Minister, at the ongoing Rise in Our Dialogue. Take a look. I want to ask you, historically, India has shied away from weaponizing trade and financial institutions. And you yourself have said that we are not in favor of national sanctions. But with the way the landscape is changing, and you've heard all the other players speak, do you think that trade barriers and tariffs and tech sanctions or tech restrictions have a place in our foreign policy or should have a place in our foreign policy?
Before I come to that, I just want to say, I can see there are really three capitalists sitting on this side, but I'm impressed to be seen as a commissar. It's a term from my youth, and I was quite amused to see it being used in this age, but I take it as a compliment. Now, your point, tariffs, sanctions, what's happening, export controls. I think whether we would like it or not, they are a reality. Countries use them. In fact, if one looks at the last decade, I would say we have seen a much greater weaponization of pretty much any kind of capability or any kind of economic activity. It could be financial flows, it could be energy supplies, it could be technology. This is the reality of the world. So, since I take the world as it is, we have to negotiate our way through that and see, how best we can do for our own country. Because at the end of the day, for a government, for a commissar of the government, you fight for your business. You fight for your business because you're fighting for your employment. You're fighting for your comprehensive national power, of which business makes a very important contribution. And I think today the lines, dividing different domains have eroded. And I think overall, if you see in international relations, I think it's a less restrained culture today than it was, say, a decade ago. And that's something we all need to factor in.
Does it bother you, the blurring lines?
I'm not, I wouldn't say it would bother me because I've seen its evolution. I mean, I just accept it as part of the playing conditions. So it's part of the assumptions. It's part of the challenge. And I would deal with it, ideally even leverage it where I can.
How do you see the weaponization of things that were intended to be global goods, like SWIFT or social media or telecom? Do you think that undermines trust in these institutions? And does it push India then to explore alternatives, perhaps homegrown ones?
Well, there are different ways of dealing with weaponization. One is to stay on the right side of the weapon. So, you don't get hit, others do. But look, here's the reality. The world today makes business decisions, factoring in national security in a manner in which it did not do so before, especially in the digital era. In the digital era, I think it's not just about cost, it is about comfort, it is about trust. So if you are today looking at this serious, at a strategic level, the business conversations, you keep hearing resilience, reliability, trust, transparency. So you want to do business more and more with those with whom you are secure. And your earlier point that everybody has, every partner offers some risks. Yes, but you would rather take the risks with those where your interests are not contradictory, then the risks are not that great, rather than those with whom your interests could clash or do clash. So I would argue today that countries, in a way, need a kind of a macro business strategy And certainly, when you look at India, when we look at the world today, we see, we are involved right now in 3 big trade negotiations with the EU, with the UK, and now with the United States. These are our growth markets. These are our technology partners. This is where people go for education. This is where people go for tourism. These are in many ways our connectivity partners. They are our strategic partners. So when we make choices, it's no longer just efficiency and cost. I think there are economic factors which I think increasingly influence business decisions. Sometimes you can be put in a situation where we say, let me devise something alternative because that is a compulsion of the day. But I would argue that's an aberration rather than than some kind of strategic desire to replace a particular system. I mean, if we can make the current system work for us, it's the smarter thing to do.
Right. Before I open it to the audience, I want to ask you one last question, and this is something that we've discussed internally as well. You see, foreign policy was designed to deal with countries, but today companies are sometimes more powerful than countries. For instance, you have Elon Musk and Starlink. With one flip of the switch, they can change the course of the war in Ukraine. Do you think foreign policy then needs to evolve, or do you leave it to regulators and financial institutions?
No, one, historically, that's not entirely the case. I would remind you of a company called East India Company, which became so big. But it's a valid point. I mean, the market cap of many companies today would probably entitle some of them, I don't know, maybe even to be part of the G20. So this is, again, a reality we have to deal with. So sometimes, you deal with them in tandem with the government. Sometimes you deal with them directly, but you have to deal with them. I mean, this is the necessity in my business.
They set off to spend 8 days in space. Their trip lasted 9 months. But finally, they're back. NASA astronauts Sunitha Williams and Barry Wilmore have finally arrived back on Earth. They made a fast re-entry through the Earth's orbit, followed by a gentle splashdown off the coast of Florida. They came out of the hatch, waving and smiling, bringing an end to a mission that has captivated global attention for months now. So what did they do in space for 9 whole months? How was their journey back? What lies ahead of them in terms of recovery? And how is the world reacting to their return? Our next report tells you.
The task get going, and you have.
Earth circled 4,576 times.
Good handle.
Distance traveled 195 million kilometers. Days spent in space 286. That's 278 days longer than anticipated. But finally, Sunitha Williams and Barry Wilmore are no longer stuck in space. They have returned to Earth.
So right now what we're doing on board Dragon is preparing for that undocking sequence to be commanded.
Hitching a different ride home than the one they went up on. Their SpaceX capsule made a fast re-entry through the Earth's atmosphere. Then 4 parachutes opened and the astronauts splashed down in calm waters off the coast of Florida as a pod of dolphins circled the craft.
Screen, we can see dolphins, actually, who want to come and play with Dragon. Now, one of the fast boats there in place working.
A recovery ship lifted the capsule out of the water. And within an hour, the NASA astronauts were out of their capsule. They smiled and waved, bringing an end to a mission that was supposed to last 8 days, but went on for 9 months.
She, like her other crew members, now will be assisted onto the mobility aid.
The saga began last year in June. Williams and Wilmore took part in a space flight on the experimental Starliner developed by the aerospace company Boeing. The capsule suffered technical problems. It was deemed too risky to take the astronauts home. So, Starliner returned safely to Earth in September, empty.
3 out, currently reefing.
While the NASA pair had to stay back. They have only been able to return now, after being stuck in space for more than 9 months. The astronauts have regularly spoken about being comfortable with their situation. While they were up there, they carried out an array of experiments. They conducted spacewalks. In fact, Williams broke the record for the woman who spent the most hours outside a space station.
Number 2,
the team also played dress-up for Christmas.
We have here with us to just prepare, which will be sort of fun.
But their journey has gripped global attention, and their return is being embraced. NASA officials have praised their resilience.
You know, the thing I think back of this whole time frame is how really resilient Butch and Sunny were the whole time. I mean, they launched on what was going to be a short test flight with the crew flight test vehicle with Boeing. And then they moved very quickly into station increment operations, and they became seamlessly part of the International Space Station. And they did that because they're experienced astronauts.
Meanwhile, people are celebrating the return, especially in Williams's Indian ancestral village.
बहुत ही खुशी है सर, पूरी रात जगे हुए, रात भी जगे, रात को भी हवन चली है और सुबह भी हवन करना है, कल भी भंडारा करना है.
So what happens next? The astronauts reunited with their loved ones and were quickly hustled away for medical checks. After all, space is tough on the human body.
That is none other than Sunny Williams.
When they come back to Earth, it's still a big difference going from that weightlessness to suddenly being under gravity again. So they have to adapt to that both physically and mentally. So they will be under direct medical supervision for a couple of weeks. Then they'll continue to do physiotherapy to make sure that they're getting back to normal as quickly as possible.
So the world has breathed a sigh of relief. The astronauts have returned home. But it will be a while before they readapt to living on Earth.
That is none other than Sunny Williams. Big smile, big...
For our last story tonight, let's talk about the ocean. It covers 70% of the Earth's surface, yet more than 80% of it remains unmapped and unexplored. Simply put, we know very little about the ocean. But a new discovery could upend what we do know. According to a recent study, lumpy metallic rocks in the deepest reaches of the ocean could be making oxygen. These are rocks in the darkest pits of the ocean. Sunlight does not reach these depths, but scientists say that this is where some rocks are producing oxygen, or what's being called dark oxygen. How is this possible, and what does this mean for us? Here is a report.
Oxygen is vital for life. About half the oxygen we breathe comes from the ocean. It is made by marine plants as they photosynthesize. As you already know, this process requires sunlight. But what if sunlight was not required to produce oxygen? This may sound bizarre, but it could be true, because scientists have discovered dark oxygen. According to a recent study, lumpy metallic rocks on the seafloor in the deepest, darkest reaches of the ocean could be making oxygen in the absence of sunlight. This claim upends everything we believe about the origins of life. According to the long-established view, life was made possible when organisms started producing oxygen via photosynthesis about 2.7 billion years ago. If this is not the cold, hard truth, if rocks can produce the so-called dark oxygen without sunlight, it calls into question the very origins of life. So how exactly is this happening? Scientists say that in the depths of the deep sea, where no sunlight can penetrate, oxygen appears to be produced by nodules. They are talking about naturally occurring potato-sized metallic nodules. These objects produce enough electrical currents to split seawater, basically H2O, into hydrogen and oxygen. You may remember that this process is called electrolysis. This is happening in the lightless abyss of the ocean and producing dark oxygen. And this is good news for mining companies. In recent years, they have appeared borderline obsessed with the deep sea. Several deep-sea mining companies have been eager to extract precious metals from the ocean bed. And these nodules are treasure for them because they can act like batteries. But this comes with many risks. Unacceptable ecological risks that could disrupt underwater life and have repercussions for the planet at large. But this isn't the only problem here. The new discovery has stirred a new debate. Some members of the scientific community have expressed their reservations about the finding. They say that the dark oxygen discovery was partly funded by a Canadian deep-sea mining company, which could bring the finding and its assumptions into question. That said, if dark oxygen exists and if lumpy rocks are producing it under the sea, then this discovery is one for the history books.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. In Hungary, chaos erupts in the parliament as leaders light smoke flares. In North Macedonia, a town square turns into a sea of light in the memory of the nightclub fire victims. In India, people gather on the streets to celebrate Rang Panchami, which is marked on the 5th day after the festival of Holi. And finally, we are taking you back in history. On this day in 2003, the US invaded Iraq to oust dictator Saddam Hussein. Washington claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. 461,000 people died in that war. It cost the US $3 trillion, but no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. We are leaving you on that note. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Képviselőtársamat őrizzék meg, összegző jelentését pedig téper. Most az összegző módosító javaslatról döntünk.
Do you think that Ukraine is at its weakest position?
This war is not about Ukraine.
Do you believe that your president was insulted? Yes or no question. Is Ukraine prepared to pay the price for that peace?
No compromises at the cost of territorial integrity and sovereignty.
Diplomacy will work?
Yes.
Do you think Russia will give up the territory if there is no ceasefire? Do you propose to keep fighting?
We are ready to resist.
Do you think there will be peace?
Many countries gave us 3 days.
President Trump said you don't have any cards.
We do not have another choice.
How do you keep fighting?
You ask me once again the same question.
Because you've not answered my question.
We have enough capacities to keep fighting.
Firstpost brings you the Ideas Pod at the Raisina Dialogue 2025, the largest gathering of global policymakers, thought leaders, and innovators, now on the fastest growing international news platform. Big ideas. Big debates. Big impact. Only at the Ideas Pod. Firstpost gives you front row access to the conversations that matter most. The Ideas Pod. Raisina Dialogue 2025 on Firstpost. From March 17th to March 19th.